Tony Ferguson was known by many as the boogeyman of the lightweight division, taking all of his opponents to deep waters and leaving them in a bloody mess. In his 12-fight win streak, he left the majority of his opponents with slices upon slices on their face and would visibly drain the life out of them as the fight went on. Cucuy spent the majority of his career at the top of the lightweight division, but like everyone else, he is still human and eventually everyone falls. Tony's downfall started at UFC 249, where he faced a reinvented Justin Gaethje, who was hungry for the belt. This was the first pay-per-view of the pandemic, and the empty crowd added to the eerie atmosphere, almost as if we knew something bad was going to happen. You could hear every punch land, shuffling of feet on the canvas, even the fighters breathing. This was evident in their fight, as the punches landing on skulls could be heard even in the commentators' microphones. Today, Tony Ferguson isn't the same, and I believe this fight caused a downfall that led to the shadow of a man we see today. From the first round, Justin used crisp boxing to land cleanly on Tony, and as the fight drew on, the punches became cleaner and cleaner. When I was watching the fight live, I was waiting for Tony Ferguson to turn the fight round, like he'd done so many times before, but it never came. Justin was landing more and more punches as the fight led on, and by the end, Tony's face was hardly recognizable. His 12-fight win streak had come to an abrupt end, his title opportunity never came, and Cucuy had been broken. In the fight, I noticed 3 or 4 things that happened throughout 24 minutes, and these same things would repeat over and over again. It's worth noting that being able to make quick adjustments mid-fight is an incredibly useful skill that few fighters are lucky enough to possess. Whether it's noticing a habit which you can exploit or finding a counter to a technique your opponent has been hitting you over and over with, being able to adjust on the fly and make intelligent reads is one of the underappreciated skills of top-level athletes. Unfortunately, Tony doesn't have this. The main takeaway I got from this fight is how fundamental striking triumphs weird unorthodox techniques, almost always. Justin Gaethje is one of the top lightweights in the world, and he does it only using 4 or 5 different strikes. These aren't flashy advanced techniques either, they're some of the first strikes a fighter will ever learn. A jab, cross, hook, uppercut and leg kick are essentially the only techniques Justin uses, yet he defeated Tony Ferguson using just them. I will get more into this later, but now I'm going to take a look at Tony Ferguson. Now, I might upset some Tony fans in this video, but as I was taking a deeper look into this fight, I saw a lot of bad habits Tony was doing, which weren't getting corrected as the fight was drawing on. I'm going to take a look specifically at things Tony was doing repeatedly, and show why those techniques and the form with which they were being done were not the best. First off is Tony's offense. As the fight goes on, the difference between each fighter's successful offense becomes enormous. Justin's momentum snowballs, while Tony lands less and less. There are 2 main reasons for this. The first being that Tony is being clobbered in the head repeatedly, and the damage is building up horrifically through 24 minutes. It doesn't matter who you are, you can't take those kinds of concussive blows and not be impacted, especially from a guy like Gaethje. Even freaks of nature can't take constant hits to the head, they can only withstand so much. The second reason of this huge divide in successful offense was the fact that Justin made reads on Tony, while Tony wasn't able to do the same. This brings me to one of the main bad habits Tony was doing. Justin could make reads and tell which attack was coming because of Tony's poor punching form. There are many instances in the fight where Tony wants to commit and land with power, but he does this by shifting his entire body forward before actually throwing a strike. This isn't effective, as your body is being propelled towards your opponent before your fists are. Leading with your body means you're putting yourself in harm's way before actually hitting your opponent. They can hit you before you hit them, even though you're the one who started the exchange. When we look at Justin, as well as other fighters with great punching form, he leads with his fists instead of his body. This is much better because in order for your opponent to hit you, they first have to evade your strike, which already difficult, becomes much harder when the punches are thrown with good form and hard to see coming. The other problem with lunging your body forward in front of your punch is it creates a huge telegraph for your opponent. The 2 points I'm making kind of add to each other, and generally are just dangerous things to do. Shifting your body before your punch leaves you in a vulnerable position, and the shifting motion gives your opponent an easy read, countering your already vulnerable position. In the fight, you can see Justin make the read and then exploit it later on. He first understands that when Tony shifts forward, a power shot is coming, and then later gets the timing to intercept the shift with a straight shot, halting Tony's advance and adding more and more to the strike discrepancy. As a side note, there's a concept where if two objects are moving towards each other, the overall impact will be greater than if one object was moving towards the other. An example of this would be when Conor McGregor fought Jose Aldo. Because Jose was moving towards Conor and essentially running at him, his head and Conor's fists both collide at speed, so then the overall collision would be greater than if Jose was still and Conor just hit him, and it was definitely a contributing factor to why Aldo went down. It was also a contributing factor to why Tony Ferguson took so much damage. Some of the worst punches that he took was when he was closing a distance and walking into shots. When Justin intercepts the shift, he hits Tony while Tony is moving towards him, therefore the collision is increased. Moving on, I saw two other areas where Tony did not show good fundamental technique, and since they're kind of linked together, I'll explain them both together. These two areas are focused around Tony's positioning, whether it be his feet or his head. In boxing, the first thing that a lot of people are taught, and rightly so, is footwork. It's important to understand that footwork in MMA is different to footwork in boxing, but many of the basics are still the same. These basics are what is missing from Tony's skill set, and he really ends up paying for it. The specific footwork I'm talking about is the stance itself and moving in and out of close range. I mentioned earlier how Tony would often get hit clean on his way into exchanges, and his footwork is one of the main reasons why. In boxing, or pretty much any other striking art, you're taught to move the foot closest to the direction you're going. What I mean by this is to go forward, you move your front foot forward, and to go left, you move your left foot first, etc. Tony's footwork was fine at range, but as he closed the distance, he stepped into a near parallel stance. Because he's put himself into this parallel stance, Tony can't quickly move away or even move his head very well. It leaves him virtually defenseless to punches that Justin throws. To make matters worse, Tony would have his chin up in the air, meaning that when he was hit in the head, he was hit clean. In boxing, we have one foot in front of the other, and we have our chin down because it protects us. With this slightly bladed stance, we can quickly move in and out of exchanges, and it allows us to slip a lot more effectively than if we were stood flat. Keeping your chin down is important as it protects arguably the most vulnerable part of your head, your jaw. Your forehead consists of a big chunky bone, while your chin is a lot smaller in comparison, and being hit clean in the jaw causes your entire head to spin, a great way of getting knocked out. To sum it up, Tony's lack of an effective stance greatly restricted his ability to move away from Justin's punches, and his chin being up in the air just makes every punch that hits him so much worse. So far, I've spoken about Tony's poor fundamentals and how it hinders both his offense and defense, but I also wanted to speak about Justin himself, and how through simple techniques executed well, he put himself at the top of one of the most competitive divisions in the UFC. After his style change following his loss to Poirier, Justin adopted a much more calculated approach to his fights, maybe apart from a couple exceptions. Under coach Trevor Whitman, Justin sharpened his tools, cut out the crazy, and put himself at the top of the division. In my opinion, Justin is one of the best examples of how mastering fundamentals will always be more effective than flashy, crazy techniques. He isn't a fighter that glides across the octagon or launches spinning attacks that never land. He uses the basics, because the basics are the best. This is how he beat Tony Ferguson, who was on a 12-fight win streak at the time. Out of the 5 or 6 main strikes Justin uses, the cross and the hook were the main strikes he used in this fight, and more often than not, they're used as counters when Tony was closing distance. It's crazy to me how 2 strikes thrown repeatedly were enough to beat Tony Ferguson, who had been a feared name for years on end. Just 2 basic techniques. The fight between Gaethje and Ferguson, to me, highlights the sheer importance and effectiveness of fundamentals, and demonstrates how crucial they are even at the highest level. I suppose that's why they're called fundamentals. Tony Ferguson has many flashy techniques, but if you can't land them or avoid counters, then what's the point? For a fighter to showcase flashy techniques, and have their finishes on everyone's Twitter feeds. They need to perfect their fundamentals first, or they'll never even get a chance to throw anything spectacular. Justin would wait for Tony to enter and get out of position, intercept with a right hand, and since Tony's feet were not in the correct position, he could also land a hook as Tony was exiting. The errors that Ferguson was making were quite basic errors, and because of that, Justin only really needed a couple techniques to win the fight, and just like that, he had beaten Tony Ferguson, the first man to beat him in about 10 years, and snap his 12-fight win streak. I do want to cut Tony Ferguson some slack because for a long time he was a very feared name in the lightweight division, and this video doesn't really do justice to some of the great things he's done. I wanted to make a video on how important fundamental techniques are, because in my opinion they are the most important techniques in any combat sport, and this fight was the best example of how fundamental techniques, if they're done properly, they can beat even the scariest of opponents. There are a few reasons why I think Tony Ferguson lacks some of these fundamental things that I'm talking about. The first reason is, of course, he was getting beat up horribly. It's one of the worst beatings I've seen live, and you can be a scary human being and you can be a freak athlete, but at the end of the day, you're still a human being, and being hit in the head like that takes its toll on your body. No matter who you are, you're not going to be operating at full capacity if you're taking concussive blow after concussive blow to the head. As the fight was going on and he was just losing more and more rounds, I also think that Tony Ferguson began to get desperate, and when you get desperate you just want to land something with power so you can hurt your opponent, so you can turn the fight around, and I suppose instinctively to land with power he just lunged his entire body forward, but that ended up getting him countered and it ended up eventually being worse for him. The final reason I'm going to talk about, and the reason I think is the most important reason why Tony Ferguson did not have the fundamentals compared to Justin Gaethje, was Tony Ferguson has never really had a head coach. He's never had someone correcting his technique or telling him what to do. There's a lot of videos of Tony Ferguson training on his own, training for 6 hours a day and stuff like that, but he's never had someone correcting him on how to throw his punches, how to step in, how to keep his chin down, stuff like that. Because he never had a head coach telling him what to do, no one ever corrected his technique, so he brought it to every fight he had, and eventually he ran into someone who could just counter his poor technique. If you compare that with Justin Gaethje, who has Trevor Whitman, one of the most decorated and technical striking coaches out there, it makes sense why Justin Gaethje was able to use his fundamental techniques to beat Tony Ferguson, who was, a great fighter, but did not have a coach telling him how to throw strikes or telling him how to use his footwork. So I think I've kind of made the points I want to make. I'm not saying that Tony Ferguson is a bad fighter. He's obviously not. He was interim champion and a 12-fight win streak and everything. This fight was just the best example, partially because of what happened in it and as well because of how big it was, of fundamentals and how just important they are. If you're trying to, improve your skills, I think this fight is a really good example of how the basic techniques are the most important ones. As a side note, in UFC, when you're watching the prelims of some fight night and the two fighters are at the opposite end of the cage and one of them throws a spinning kick, it's a pet peeve and it drives me nuts, but that's beside the point. That's my video. I finished my video. I apologize for not uploading for 3 weeks. I've been busy, but yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope maybe you learned something. If you have anything to say, feel free to leave a comment, and thank you for watching.